As one of the most wildly entertaining open world games in recent memory, Saints Row III remains a classic to this day and one well worth revisiting. Yet if you played it on PlayStation 3 or Xbox 360, it's also a game with a lot of technical shortcomings. This past week, however, Saints 3 arrives on Nintendo Switch, courtesy of Deep Silver Fish Labs, and with it, hope for a polished console version of the game. Yet, just a few minutes into this version, it becomes extremely clear that things aren't quite right, and what we're dealing with might actually be worse than the original release and one of the worst Switch ports we've ever tested. And to join me in discussing this smoldering wreckage, I'm joined by Richard Ledbetter. Richard.
Hello there, John.
Hey. So, we have both experienced some of this port, and it has some issues to say the least.
Yeah, and I think we've actually experienced it on multiple fronts because we've essentially gone back and played it on every single platform at this point, haven't we?
Yes, that's right, and I think this is key to the discussion. So, Saints Row III was really good on PC, but if you were playing on 360 or PS3, the performance, especially looking back on it now, is not very good at all. So on PS3, it runs completely unlocked, triple buffered, but it's very, very unstable, and the whole game feels juddery to the point where I purchased it back in the day and ended up not playing it on consoles because I just couldn't deal with the performance. And on Xbox 360, it's a little different, isn't it?
Yeah, so we've got some archive footage here of both versions running, but we have put them through the modern version of our tools, and the thing that sort of stands out to me is that they're both really bad performers. Generally, they're both unlocked, but the primary difference between the two is that, as you say, PlayStation 3 triple buffered, therefore no screen tearing. Xbox 360 though, wow, that's pretty nasty, and well, I don't really know what to say about this, except the one saving grace, I guess, on Xbox 360 is if you look at the frame time line there on the graph, it's pretty consistent. But you can see that with the PlayStation 3, because it is using a triple buffered VSync, the response is kind of wavering above and below the 360 line, so it's more juddery. So 360, more consistent, but some really bad screen tearing, really bad. And PlayStation 3, VSynced, no tearing at all, but judder city.
And I think on 360 there's even a VSync mode though, but then that's like a double buffer mode, I believe.
Yeah, we've got some footage of that here. It's not pretty, to say the least. So you can have the game standard, which is with the tearing, but you can actually dip into a menu and turn on VSync. But it is double buffered, as you say, just as the VSync off version is. And you can see that we're basically careening between 20 to 30 frames per second, and really ugly. A sort of interesting point of discussion here is that even with the VSync mode on, there's a touch of tearing right at the top of the screen there, which I found oddly amusing. But it says to me that going back right to the beginning of this game on console, performance was an issue. And
exactly.
Yeah.
So, like I said, I had some hope that the Switch could sort of fix this and we would have a high-quality console release, but that is not the case here. There are a lot of problems with this port, and I guess I should note that this is the launch version. There does seem to be a patch in the works that's not out yet, but based on what we're seeing here and knowing, the way the Switch is designed, I'm not sure there's going to be any way to completely salvage this. But before we get to the bad, I guess we should mention that unlike the last gen versions, this does actually run at full 1080p when docked, and you get a native 720p in mobile. So in that sense, it's pretty sharp. But at the same time, a lot of the other buffers they use in creating the image they all appear to be quarter resolution. So you see a lot of very chunky pixels on things, especially on edges. Anything next to alpha effects or with depth of field, and even with shadows, it's just it's kind of a mess. So,
wow.
Its image quality is a little bit improved, but it's not great. I would say overall, it's not a clean looking game.
So these quarter resolution buffers, are they full resolution or half resolution on the last gen platforms?
Yeah, so based on a presentation they did, we know that some of the buffers on PS3, they're 800 by 450 resolution, so quite a dip. And it seems like the Switch kind of follows suit, although they both look very similar despite the Switch's base resolution being higher. So taken together then, I kind of feel like the PS3 looks better, more consistent overall here, just because the resolution sort of matches up better between the two.
Yeah.
But there are other areas that are extremely consistent between the two, namely like LOD management. So I actually set up a scene here where we're driving along on both versions, and you can see everything just sort of pops in at exactly the same time. And if I do the same on foot, pay attention to the wires and trees and other things in the background, you can see that they hit at exactly the same point. So in that sense, it does seem to be using the typical console settings, so you're not getting necessarily any extra draw in, but you do get slightly improved texture filtering, possibly due to the higher resolution, probably in fact. But yeah, it looks pretty similar overall, and I should also note that the differences in the colors here just comes down to the time of day and weather systems, which are extremely dynamic, making it very, very difficult to line up scenes that look identical. But, you get an idea of what's being drawn here. It's very similar.
Yeah, I think an issue that we kind of need to highlight over and above graphics is the feel just isn't right at all.
Yes, there does seem to be a significant amount of input latency in this version of the game. I was having a very difficult time, especially through the capture hardware, but even on my direct television, just lining up shots, like aiming, driving, all the actions you're expected to do, it was very difficult. And I was just thinking, like, wow, like, something's off. And then I picked it up and played it, the same scenes on PS3, and I had zero problems, like, lining up headshots and just, dodging through traffic. It felt so much more natural, despite that version also running rather poorly.
Yeah, I played it in mobile mode, and you're right, the input lag is really, really bad, and I thought possibly it might be a dead zone issue on the analog sticks, but I moved the sensitivity in the options to maximum to 100. And yes, it does help marginally, but the input latency is still really, really poor. And so, yeah, I mean, this is, frame rate is something we'll talk about in a minute, but, spoilers, it's not great. But fundamentally, even when it's running sort of fairly well, it doesn't feel right. It just doesn't feel good.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I guess one other thing I noticed in some scenes, especially during some of these cutscenes here, there is actually a subtle difference in things like the color is shifted in certain sequences, and there's a little bit of extra bloom that sometimes appears on the Switch. Though sometimes the reverse is true, and PS3 has more bloom. And also the Switch version appears somewhat darker, and both of course are outputting in the limited RGB mode here to the same capture device, and yeah, it's just dark by default. And then there's also things like shadows, which are extremely chunky on both, but actually appear even noisier on the Switch with more visible artifacts, especially at a distance. So, it's similar to the last gen version, but rougher in many ways, despite the higher resolution.
Yeah,
and then there's the lag.
Yeah, and I think there's possibly a hint to what's going on when we talk about those lower resolution buffers and the shadows. Possibly a GPU bandwidth issue here.
Yeah, so this is, as we delve into performance, I think this is, something to note. So reading up, this engine appears to use some form of deferred rendering. They call it inferred, which allowed them to, take a different approach. It allowed MSA support on the PC and whatnot. But the point is, though, is that, it has a seemingly fat G buffer, if you will. And, deferred rendering in general does not work especially well on hardware like the Switch. It's not a good solution for mobile hardware. And I've discussed this with developers working on Switch and other mobile platforms, and they all kind of tend to agree on this, note where it's like, this engine is basically doesn't seem like it was suited for a platform like the Switch. And so outside of rebuilding the game from scratch with this hardware in mind, I can imagine that the development team here faced a lot of difficulties in bringing it over.
Yeah, it's not a pretty picture in many scenes. Are there any positives here beyond the resolution?
I'm gonna say no. So right away, things are off. I mean, the frame rate, it is unlocked, so it's very juddery. Anytime you get into any of the major action sequences, the frame rate just plummets like a stone. I mean, it absolutely plummets regularly. We're talking like there's a sequence here where you're skydiving from the plane. It's right at the beginning, it shows the distant city there in front of you, which is, I can imagine being draining, but it's not like it's actually the full detail. The point is, though, is it drops as low as like 13 or 14 frames per second when docked, which is just nuts.
The thing is, though, the original versions could also drop into the teens on console.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The original versions run similarly poorly, but I feel like there's more fluctuation on Switch. Like, there's points where you look in one direction and it kind of spikes up to almost like 50 frames per second. You look back down and it's back in the teens, and there's just this wild swing between the different levels of performance. Though, when you're actually on the ground, like again, here's the scene I've set up, driving through the city, using the same car on both PS3 and Switch. And if you look at the frame rate graph here, they're remarkably similar. They sort of follow the same curve. They, start to improve at exactly the same spots, and then they sort of go down at the same spots. But they also sort of trade blows. So during some scenes, the PS3 is faster. During other bits, the Switch is faster. But they're always within like 1 to 4 frames of each other, I guess. So there's this sense that, the engine is struggling in exactly the same way on both machines.
This is fascinating, really, isn't it? Because, PS3 and Switch, they're two entirely different architectures.
Yes.
One may be one version may be a port of the other, but to see that kind of parity of sorts is kind of fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It's a very strange thing indeed, and it mostly applies to traversal, and that's what I found is during traversal they're very similar. During action sequences, the Switch is more variable, with lower lows and higher highs. But anything that seems to stress, I guess any part of the system, an explosion or physics or anything like that, it will drop the frame rate really hard on the Switch. Yeah, like you see here with this barrel that I shot. I guess this whole scene was kind of running slow anyway, but still, obviously engaging in combat can cause some serious dips. And anything where you're sort of zoomed out and looking down on the city, I suppose, as well, like the introduction to the penthouse mission, where you skydive out of a helicopter and land on the top floor and then sort of take over the place. As you can see, the frame rate on the way down is also pretty bad, and it just doesn't feel smooth at all to play. And then there's also things like loading, I should mention real quick, which is slightly faster on PS3. Like this during this intro sequence here, you're watching the introduction real-time cutscene at the bank. It transitions from that cutscene to the gameplay very seamlessly on PS3. If we switch back to the Switch version, that same bit, it goes from the cutscene, fades to black, then you get an actual loading screen. And then after the loading screen, it goes to the game. So it's just enough where it sort of ruins that sense of, seamlessness that the original had going for it. Not a huge difference. It's not like the loading is super long, but it's very strange to me that it is actually slower on the Switch. I mean, it's a solid state storage versus Blu-ray with a partial install, and the PS3 is not known for its fast I/O.
Well, that's true, and and it is the same assets, right? I mean, the Switch isn't spooling in higher resolution textures.
Exactly.
Right.
The textures, at least as far as I can tell from side-by-side comparisons, they look basically identical between the two. Everything really is about the same. It's just the performance is just bad throughout, and it's that combination of severe input latency, highly variable performance, huge dips in performance, and all of that just comes together to create something that feels... I might actually say this is the worst performing thing we've ever tested on the Switch. Well, okay, wait, I take that back. It's not as bad as Ark Survival Evolved.
I was about to say.
It's not that bad, but it's close. It's like this is one step up from Ark.
Wow. Now, usually when we're talking about bad performance in docked, it's kind of usually even worse when undocked, when playing portably. So what's the situation with this one?
Yeah, so this is interesting then. Performance is bad in portable as well, but it's slightly faster overall, and I suspect that this has to do with the lower overall resolution. I'd imagine if docked had been 900p, for instance, it would have been similar or better than portable mode. but you're still getting huge dips, but the lowest lows are not as low in portable mode. So in that sense, when playing on the go, it winds up feeling a lot more like the PlayStation 3 version overall, where it doesn't dip to insanely low levels, but it's still highly variable. And if it wasn't for the input latency, I would say it's actually quite a decent... It feels like playing the PS3 version on the go, basically. I don't want to say it's good, but it does look reasonably sharp on that screen, and it is somewhat playable. So in that sense, you know, if you were just going to play this in mobile mode, maybe it's not a bad way to go, but you know, I still can't really recommend it.
Yeah, that's how I played it, in mobile mode, and it just feels really rough around the edges, and I think the game kind of feels its age, even though I think that if they could have got a consistent frame rate on it, it actually would have been really good fun, despite the sort of aged visuals, because it's just a whole lot of fun, this game. But yeah, I actually took this game into my exploited Switch to see what the clock speeds were. 384 megahertz when running in mobile mode, which is, you know, sort of standard. Doesn't use any of the overclocking loveliness that has been added to recent Switch revisions. But I did actually overclock the game.
Wow, yes.
So yeah, I am overclocked it. The CPU plus 75%, 1785 megahertz, plus 20% on memory bandwidth to 1600 megahertz, the same as docked, and GPU at 460 megahertz, which is Nintendo's new max frequency for mobile play. And I'm not going to say there's a revelatory increase in performance. I think it is better, but let's just say that if there is a patch coming and the developers have pulled something out of the hat here, I'm going to be shocked, because certainly adding a vast amount of extra compute power to the game isn't really producing any kind of game-changing experience.
Yeah, that seems to be the gist of it then. So, you know, I guess it's worth keeping an eye on whatever patch they come up with. I've heard that there's some issues with crashing after certain missions, making it difficult to progress, things like that. I would hope that those would be solved in the patch. Maybe we'll see a slight boost to performance that could bring it up closer to maybe, say, PS3 on average.
Right.
You know, but just knowing how the engine is designed and what the Switch is, and, you know, I can't really see there being any sort of massive gain here. And I would love to be wrong. Maybe they've got some kind of trick up their sleeve, but if they shipped it in this state, I don't think like a couple extra weeks or however many weeks they've been working on this patch will necessarily be enough to solve it, or at least based on our own experience looking at all the software we've tested, it's not a common thing. It's almost never happens where you see that kind of massive boost that would solve a game like this.
Well, it's one of these situations where I would really love to be proved wrong, but I think there's two ways of looking at this. In the negative way, judged by modern standards, it's not great. The performance level just isn't there. The graphics have aged somewhat, but gameplay solid. Oh, input lag. Wow, that really has to be addressed. That surely they can fix that, or at least improve it. But secondly, if you play it in mobile mode, it is very, very similar to the PlayStation 3 version, which,
Exactly.
So if you go in with the expectation of, hey, this is the PS3 game on the Switch, then possibly you won't be disappointed, apart from the controls.
Yeah, it plays like a last generation game. I mean, this is the kind of performance you often saw last gen, and that's something people seem to forget. A lot of titles these days do deliver close to a locked 30 FPS, these big open world games, but that was not the case last generation at all. Open world games in general really struggled to get to 30 and often dropped well below that. That was just kind of the norm, and Saints Row 3 follows that trend exactly. So if you were okay with that sort of performance and you're playing in portable mode, yeah, it kind of works.
But I think the point is that we kind of really like the game, but if you want the best experience in the here and now, it's still PC, right? And you actually went back to that version.
Yes, that's correct. I installed it on my PC this weekend and played around with it, and yeah, of course, it runs like a dream and has a lot of extra visual settings that you can adjust. I even went so far this weekend as to insert reshade with ray tracing or the path tracing feature into the game. So, you know, we have the Switch at the one end of the spectrum, and on the exact opposite end, we have the PC version running with path tracing, screen space path tracing.
How does it look?
It kind of works. It's there's still limits to it. One of the things I like is I found that their implementation of ambient occlusion back then was a little bit overly intense, if you will. Like, it puts a lot of black, very dark black shadowed outlines around objects, and it's not on the Switch, by the way. There isn't really any AO there at all, I should note, but it is available on the PC, and I don't like it. You can disable it and use the path tracer instead, which sort of simulates the same effect in a much more natural way, and it sort of cleans up the visuals as a result, and it ends up looking nice. I mean, the performance, of course, using this shader does drain resources a lot, so you're gonna have to lower your resolution, of course, but the results are pretty cool, and it's neat to see a game like this sort of rebirthed in this way. And the game is still a lot of fun. It's still hilarious. Stuff just goes hilariously wrong. That's one of my favorite parts about it, actually. Even back on the Switch, I mean, I just walked up to this intersection here, and I stood there for about 5 minutes and just captured. And I've sped it up here. You just watch this insanity. The AI it's like there's two police cars blocking this intersection, and then everybody's just like driving all over, ramming into each other, exploding cars, just like getting stuck on things. I mean, it's just complete chaos ensues. And that's one of the things that makes Saints Row 3 so darn good.
But in the here and now, we can't really recommend it on Switch,
No.
but surely you should be able to pick it up for a pittance on PC.
Exactly. And yeah, I think it holds up. If you got a PC and you're itching for some Saints Row and you haven't played the Saints Row the Third, what are you waiting for? It's good stuff. But I think that's going to wrap it up for the moment here. Thanks for joining me, Rich.
It's been a pleasure.
And as always, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell at the top to help out the channel, and always be updated on the latest video from Digital Foundry. And of course, follow us over on Twitter to discuss things such as Saints Row, or perhaps Buggy Saints Row the musical. Anyone?
Where's my f***ing car? I had some sweet ass wheels. It's hard to do a drive-by on your feet.
Until next time, this is John and Rich signing off.
What is this place? Is it heaven or hell here? Is it from earth that I fell down here? Well, I was just driving my